Boston has always lived in Salem's shadow when it comes to witchcraft history. Salem gets the books, the tours, the movies, and the cultural shorthand. But Boston had its own witchcraft period and it lasted over a century. Welcome to the Thing About Witch Hunts podcast. I'm Josh Hutchinson.
I'm Sarah Jack. The women accused outside of Salem don't always fit the familiar mold. They were wealthy widows, Catholic immigrants, and women who simply refused to cooperate with people who had power over them. Well, that does sound familiar. Their stories survived in court records, personal diaries, and archives.
Today we're talking with Brenton Simons, President Emeritus of American Ancestors, aka the New England Historic Genealogical Society, and the author of a great book, Witches, Rakes, and Rogues.
Welcome to the Thing About Witch Hunts, Brenton Simons. Tell us about your work and expertise.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me here today. I'm the President Emeritus, and I was the CEO of American Ancestors for 18 years. I'm still there now as the President Emeritus, and I work with people all over the world in tracing their family history. We have more than 500,000 members in 139 countries. So most of my career has been in advancing the work of our organization based in Boston, but available online everywhere through AmericanAncestors.org, and really helping people of all backgrounds learn about their history. Personal specialties has been Boston history in the pre-federal period. And what is relevant to the work that you're doing is a book I wrote a number of years ago called Witches, Rakes, and Rogues, which is all the history of Boston that you didn't read about in the classic history books. And that includes the amazing witchcraft period, which went from 1630 to 1741. So that's been a great interest of mine, and many, many other topics and fields of interest. But that's where I've really spent the bulk of my career.
You've been honored by King Charles III for services to Anglo-American history. Can you tell us about that experience?
Yeah, well, that was quite an honor and quite a surprise. And that was for longtime services to Anglo-American history. And what we've done in that over many years are things like the Great Migration Study Project, which is a multi-volume series of books that treat all of the immigrants to New England in the period of 1620 to 1640. That's been a tremendous contribution to the history of the British peopling of North America. We've run tours to the UK for decades. We publish family histories and source records for the United Kingdom, and basically have done a lot of work in advancing the English history of New England in particular. And that was quite a lovely honor. And I was made a member in, I think it was 2023, and there was a ceremony in 2024, and Sir John Major, the former prime minister, was there for it. And it's quite a lovely honor. And I see it as recognition for not just for me, but really for all the amazing colleagues I've worked with over the last 30 years. You don't get any of this work done without a team, and I've had the best team possible in the work I've done over many years.
That's wonderful. I was really fortunate to get to visit American Ancestors in November with David Allen Lambert. We had given testimony for a bill. We're hoping to exonerate the executed and accused witches of Boston specifically, and those who haven't been recognized in Massachusetts. And it was a wonderful visit. You mentioned your colleagues, and it just such a team. You really feel like you're walking into this community. It was so welcome, and I loved every part of it. I loved the entry with the beautiful map, and your bookstore is great. But the library and those books that are available to your members, that just was really fascinating to me. I was very interested to see the different witchcraft history books that you had there, got to look at those. So I just wanted to mention that American Ancestors, your new building is beautiful, and it was really special for me to get to visit.
Well, thank you. And I'm so glad you did. And David Lambert is our chief genealogist. He's the only person who's been on the staff longer than I have, but only by a few months. And so we've worked together for over 30 years, which is really much longer than it feels like. But yeah, we're excited. The building expanded on Newbury Street. We were able to incorporate the building next door and have a much livelier, more engaging entryway so that families and children and tourists and local residents can come in and have what we call a no-fail history experience. And so whatever your background, you can come in and do something that engages you in the study of history. And the good news is that kids really love this. And so as there arguably is less history taught in schools today, we've seen that as an opportunity to come in and do some special things, both in person and online, and with teachers around the country to bring history, and particularly family history, into the classroom. And I'd just add to that now there is data that shows that when young people are exposed to family history as a learning tool, that it gives them greater poise, self-confidence, and this is for inner city kids and suburban kids, all kids. And we knew that anecdotally for a long time, but it's great to see evidence that this really does bolster the young people in important ways, and it's good for our country.
Absolutely. And you do have a lot of amazing online programming as well.
Oh, yeah, we do that because when I started, we gave lectures and we were happy if 40 or 50 people attended in the building. But by being able to take all the intellectual capital that we have in our building and in our staff and all the scholars and popular historians that work with us, by communicating that outwards, we can reach thousands of people. And those video presentations are archived on our YouTube channel. It's a great way to engage people and make them a part of what we do. And our programming, I will say, our programming is a lot of fun. It's great. We work with some of the leading people in the field. We also work with Henry Louis Gates on the television show Finding Your Roots. We're the anchor location and one of the principal researchers and nonprofit partners to Skip Gates and that show. And we work with others. We are having a program in April with Glenn Close. And so we are very active in our programming and trying to reach people in all corners of the world.
It's really wonderful. History is so important, and getting people involved at an early age just really makes a difference.
Yeah, I agree. And a lot of us who've been there a long time had the interest as kids. I mean, I was interested in family history as a kid, and I wrote to my grandparents, and I've saved those letters. And I'm very thankful for that now, that it blossomed in me at an early age, because it gave me some connections with my grandparents, some memories that I really cherish now. And as they got older and weren't able to travel, and I was able to go to places like American Ancestors, also known as New England Historic Genealogical Society, and find things and send it to them. So I look back on that as a wonderful multi-generational connection. And you see that in families today. Grandparents want to capture materials to share with their grandchildren. Kids want to work on this in school. And it's really a great thing to see.
We love your book. We've really enjoyed reading it. We've been reading over the last month or so and talking about the stories in it. So we're really excited to get to talk to you about that collection today.
Well, thank you again for having me. It was a very, very fun book to write. It came about in kind of an interesting way. I realized I'd done research on the Greenleaf murders, which is a pretty sordid, sad tale. But by the 20th century, this story of what arguably is a serial murder case had become mythic. Historians were saying it never happened. And yet there were such odd clues that maybe it really had happened. And so I did research on that, and I found the original court records, which had been filed in a very, very strange, counterintuitive way at the state archives. And I thought, aha, this is why people thought it never happened. They couldn't find the original documents. They went to the logical places to look for them where the records should have been, but they weren't there. And so in the 20th century, you had people saying this was all mythology. And so I debunked the debunking, if you will. And in the process of that, I thought, well, Boston is America's great history city. And if it's lost track of this story, what else has it lost track of? And that's when I thought, okay, well, witches right away, because as you know, with the work you do, Salem witchcraft has always had the greatest attention. And there wasn't a book about Boston witchcraft. There was a little section in Justin Windsor's Memorial History of Boston that touched on Boston witchcraft, but it hadn't been studied methodically as a topic, and it was missing a lot of stories. And so I dug into it, and at the time started reading every diary for the period, in every word of every diary, every court record I could put my hands on, every source, because unlike Salem, there weren't voluminous court records described everything that happened. There were some, but it was a tough set of stories to put together because there was just thinner evidence and less of a record. But when all is said and done, there were a lot of materials. And so I loved doing it. And witches have always been a source of fascination to me. And I was excited to do it. I have to say one thing, though. People say to me, are you descended from a witch? And I'm not. I am related to a couple of witches, which I've discovered later. And I'm not the first person in my family to write a book on witches and witchcraft either. I found out, and again, after writing the book, that one of my ancestors, who was a minister, had written a book in the 17th century on witchcraft. So it's odd how things come full circle, but it was a fun book to write and to be able to tell people a part of Boston history, which most people just had no idea.
Yeah, what struck me reading, especially about the Rakes and the Rogues, the crimes that they were committing are crimes that we're all familiar with today. And it made the people of that time seem like very ordinary people like us. And it really connected me more to that period than I think learning about all the virtuous people actually does.
Well, that's a really good point, Josh. And that was definitely the feeling I had too when the book was done, was that all of the things we see today have happened before. And this was when, I think about the time it was coming out, there was, you might remember the Clark Rockefeller case, and someone who was an imposter, and then later it turned out he'd committed murder in California, and he'd gone by several fake names and created aliases. And all of that's in the book too. That all happened in the colonial period. And so it was this amazing, there were so many connectors to the present day in it. And I didn't want to, there are so many books that go into the people who were great history makers and the importance of what they did. But this was to look at a largely different group of people who hadn't been written about.
And how long did it take you to kind of put these three things together, witches, rakes, and rogues? Did the stories themselves bring them together, or?
Well, yeah, it's kind of a potpourri of stories. And the publisher wanted a precise length of the book. So I actually left a lot of stories on the cutting room floor, as it will, because I had to write to a certain length. But it was very hard not to keep researching, because you'd scroll through early documents, early papers, diaries, and you'd read about something and it was fascinating. And then you'd get off into another story, and it was very easy to be distracted by all of the interesting things there were. But I wanted to put together the ones that I thought would make an anthology of nonfiction stories that would hang together and be a little collection of stories. The research took 5 years. The writing took 1 year. Frankly, the easiest part was to write it. It was the research that was tough and enjoyable, but hard to find materials sometimes. And it required a lot of research that ended up not being used just because you had to research people on the periphery of your story. And that made the research project part of it a lot longer than the writing part. But it was great to go down those rabbit holes and a lot of fun to put it together.
What is your favorite story that you collected?
Oh, that's a great question. I guess I'm sentimental about the Greenleaf story because and that's the murder story to which I alluded earlier, because that's the one that got it rolling, and I'd done a couple of articles on it, and I think just by showing that something that people, even Walter Mere Whitehill, who was the great Boston historian of the 20th century, had said this didn't happen, and so to realize that history is that things aren't permanent, that things will change. As sources are discovered or as things are interpreted, the story will change. And I think that one, I am also partial to the witches. I think Anne Hibbins was one who particularly stands out to me as an interesting lady because she was not the stereotypical witch. This was a wealthy lady. She had crabbedness of personality, as someone said at the time. And she sort of epitomized the story of a woman who had been protected by a husband, but as soon as he died, she was not protected. And most of all, she was a background character, as you know, in the Scarlet Letter. So everyone if you read that in high school, has read her name. And so here was a fictional book that had an actual Boston witch in it as a background character. And so I thought her story deserved to be told. So that's one that jumps out at me too. If I can pick two favorites, maybe those would be the two.
When I got a hold of your book, there were two of the witchcraft stories that I was most interested in. One was Mary Hale because she's an ancestor, and your article that you had published showing her connection to Winifred has been really important to me in my genealogy research. But Anne Hibbins was the other one. I couldn't wait to get into that chapter to see what I was going to learn because I find her story it's fascinating, but it's heartbreaking. And it was more heartbreaking reading more details. I found her squabble with the tradesmen and then the church stuff and the course. I just couldn't believe it. Your storytelling is wonderful. So when you said the writing part was faster, that amazes me at your skill with that too, because reading your stories is wonderful. And I learned about the witch trials more from Anne's story because I didn't realize that they would have had a special minstrel message right before they hanged her. I'm like, man, I just can't believe everything she went through. And I know I am rambling, so I'm going to give you a chance to talk about it. But I was just really moved by her experience.
Well, just backing up, first of all, I'm thrilled to hear you're descended from Mary Hale. That was such a wonderful thing to be able to connect those women together. And so in addition, as you mentioned, in addition to telling the story of Mary Hale in the book, I've also published that article that you saw on connecting the three generations together. And so interesting that Boston witchcraft tentacles reached out to Hartford, Connecticut, where more occurred for the same family. And so I thought, this is just like, I was thinking about that over the last few days, thinking, how long did that tradition of the women in that family being accused of witchcraft, how long did that persist? And what impact did it have on their lives? And so meeting you as a descendant is a thrill. And I will say, Mary Hale is the one a lot of people descend from. And since the book came out, that is the one where even a few times a year, I will meet someone who says, I'm descended from her, and through the Benhams. And so it is very exciting that has all now been pieced together. And on your comments on Anne Hibbins, yeah, I mean, that's the one where there were some really juicy sources, if you will, because she had so many problems. And unlike, for example, Mary Glover, aka Goody Glover, who was a servant class, who spoke Gaelic, who was sort of at the other end of the social spectrum, Anne Hibbins was, her husband was a brother-in-law of Governor Bellingham. She had sons who lived in Ireland. And she also broke the stereotype of the witch. In her estate inventory, there are references to silks and dresses of different colors. And she left a diamond ring, and she had things. This was a woman with substantial material possessions, even though her husband had had a significant financial reversal. Mr. Hibbins, her second husband, after they got to Boston, they were still among the elite. And again, as I said before, she really shows the scenario of someone who was somewhat protected while her husband was alive, but as soon as he died, she was not a popular lady, and the town came after her. It's a pretty clear-cut retribution story, if you will.
Yeah, it's really interesting. Her husband's his own positions in the government as an assistant in the general court. He might have been on the court of assistants that sat at any of the witch trials before Anne Hibbins. Possibly. I haven't looked into that yet, but coming soon.
That's a great point. There's always more to be discovered, and those connections can be really surprising. But you could see him in the background telling her, please just cooperate with the church. Please just accept. For your viewers, what one of the things we're referring to was the dispute she had with a carpenter, where she felt he'd done a very poor job in work in her house, and she didn't want to pay him, and he wanted to be paid, and a settlement was reached, and she was not happy with that. And the church hauled her in a few times, and she was very obstreperous and challenging. And today we would look at that as someone standing up for themselves and someone who didn't want to be pushed around. But at the time, you could see poor Mr. Hibbins saying, just accept it, accept the settlement, do it, cooperate. And she didn't really do that. And she was criticized for that, but for not obeying her husband. Her problems just mounted and mounted and mounted, and she was not going to accommodate other people in the way they wanted to be accommodated. And she wasn't going to practice the norms of the society in which she lived.
Yeah. I was always, before I had read some of the details that you were able to, like that, like your story really gives her a voice, and you are able to see that she was not agreeable with what she was being told. Before I thought, man, she had sons somewhere. We know she had sons. What was that like for them? And then it sounds like one of her sons tried to get there and do something even.
Yeah, Jonathan Moore rushed over from Ireland I'm sure, to try to reverse the course of what was happening, and it was too late and too little too late. And what we don't know is, does she have descendants? And with 3 sons, she probably does.
Yeah.
That's something that would be nice to know more about. And that was the kind of thing I could have just kept going on for years, researching this, and the families. And so I'm glad, at least with the Hale story, we were able to line that all up. I worked hard on trying to find out her maiden name. She made a bequest to a cousin named Captain Mark Coe in London, who was an important figure in London during the Cromwellian period. And that, again, points to a pretty elite background. And so more could be discovered on her, which would be great. But yes, her youngest son did come over and try to help things move in her favor, and it didn't work.
Yeah.
As a widow, she was vulnerable to the charges, and not having a male adult son to come to her aid because of the way the law worked at the time. It wasn't in a woman's favor to have a large estate that you're in control of. We see it with Catherine Harrison in Connecticut. It's the same situation. Her husband dies. She's left with a big estate. People start vandalizing her livestock, and she gets accused of witchcraft. And we see it today in especially places like India and parts of Africa. Widows and widowers are often the targets of witchcraft accusations today. So she was definitely in a vulnerable state, even though, as you pointed out, her wealth and her status, she should have been looked favorably upon.
Yeah, and in her case, it was her, again, natural crabbedness. I think one of the Mathers said that about her. But the other indicator in the Boston cases that I wrote about was it was often a single woman, a widow, but just as often some form of medical practitioner. So a midwife or an herbalist or someone who treated people. And there's something about that, and women who were at odds with their neighbors. And I think it was Mary Hale, your ancestor, who was arguing with neighbors and always in a sort of going from one little argument or problem to another, and a personality characteristic. So there were that combination of a single or independent woman or a working woman in medicine, someone who was, today we would probably look at it as just sticking up for themselves. Maybe they were disagreeable, probably so, but whatever. That combination, just the Puritan elders of the town just couldn't handle it. And it allowed the local people to form an opinion against someone. And that then took on momentum. It's very clear you don't need things like, what is it, St. Anthony's fire, or you don't need mass hysteria. You don't need medical reasons to explain the Boston witchcraft cases. It's pretty clear cut that these were people who had in some way fallen afoul of Puritan norms and maybe again were independent women practicing some form of medicine in some cases, and they were vulnerable, and that just made them vulnerable to these charges. And for at least four of them, it took the ultimate toll of their life. And for others, it just ruined their lives. I mean, even the people who weren't executed, you can imagine that they just, who knows what privations and indignities and terrible situations they had to endure just by having been brought into cases like this. It is revealing about human nature as much as anything.
And it is really great that you were able to dive into these individual stories, where with Salem, there's all these accusations and all these players, and then these other silver bullet theories have been slapped on there that popular culture grabs onto. But with Boston, you can really look at the lives and how things unfolded for them. And I think with Goody Glover, it's very interesting that hers really started with a crime, a supposed crime, an alleged crime that wasn't a witchcraft crime.
Yeah. Well, that's right. And she was, of course, a very interesting case because she professed to being a Roman Catholic. She spoke Gaelic. She was someone who, she did odd things. I mean, there's no question about it, with the poppets and licking stones. And, she'd lick a stone and the Goodwin children would go wild. And I think one of the comments was they would bark like so many dogs and purr like cats. And one of the children flew across the room without touching the floor over 20 feet, and just things like that happened that were, at least to the locals, indicated that she was torturing them. And so it was an interesting case for those reasons, but also because at one point, and again, I think the Mathers might be the source for this, she was looked at, inspected by doctors to see if she was crazed in her intellectuals. And we read about her and think, well, she might have had some real mental issues, but she was also a very different woman, a Roman Catholic who spoke Gaelic in a Puritan town. And who knows what practices she was we don't really know what she was doing that appeared so strange, other than the puppets and what was reported. But some of these might have been the legacy of rituals she knew from having grown up in another culture in another way. And so you really do feel sorry for her, in that clearly something is going on with her. Probably she is having mental, who knows? And I mean, it could have been anything. We don't know what her problems were, but she clearly was having them. And the Goodwin children were acting out. And you have to think about just knowing children. They were getting attention. Did they, dramatize this even more? Did they accentuate it? Because the more wilder they were, the more attention they got from people. So that's a little bit of a 21st century armchair look back at it. But you read it and you try to rationalize what was going on. And that, to me, I think is going to be most people's read on it. And so she's interesting. And so I liked writing about her too, even though she's at the other end of the spectrum from Anne Hibbins, but they do sort of bookend each other in an interesting way.
The Goodwin children's afflictions are very interesting, how when they did something that they liked to do, they seemed to be healthy. They slept well at night. They could eat when they wanted to, but cleaning a table that was dirty, they didn't do. Cleaning a table that was already clean, they would do. Religious texts being read to them, they would balk at it, but something frivolous read to them, they were thrilled with. So it seemed like they had some degree of choice, at least, in the matter. Yeah.
I agree with you. I think it comes off that way. It comes off as kids not really having any sense of the consequences of what their behavior was leading to.
When Josh and I were talking about it, and this is like one of the reasons reading is so important, and looking at others' research, you're revisiting something you might think you know. And we talk about Salem a lot and the afflictions there, but Josh brought up to me yesterday, there could have been a real fear of a curse here. The kids might have truly feared Goody Glover. And I hadn't really considered the weight of that.
Well, not only the kids. I think one has to get back into the 17th century mindset. Devils and imps that made magical appearances and then disappeared in several of the witchcraft cases, and other weird angels and omens. But these were things that were, especially the thought of the devil's work, this was something everyone was hearing about from the pulpit. This was real to them. Whether they witnessed beds levitating and every detail that we have in some of the testimony, and I particularly like the Samuel Elvis's testimony on Mercy Short's case, I think it is, where he goes into an amazing description of what he saw. You have to wonder, what did he actually see versus what level of embellishment is going on here? But everyone would have feared the work of the devil, and this was not as outlandish to them as it is to us. So these kids may well have started with a genuine fear of Mary Glover, but they may have also embellished it and acted out. So it's a combination of people thinking these things are real, but also retribution is very clear too. It's an odd dynamic that led in very fateful and violent deaths for some of these witchcraft victims.
Yeah, you mentioned Mercy Short. Her case and the case of Margaret Rule, I find really fascinating, how they were afflicted. Largely, it overlapped Salem witch trials a little bit, but a lot of it happened in 1693 as well. So I find that interesting that in that case, there wasn't like a renewed effort at witch hunting caused by those cases. Why do you think they wouldn't have gotten into witch hunting again?
So that's a great question. And I loved that there was an intersection between the Boston and Salem cases. And of course, It was the Sarah Good, the encounter with Sarah Good that led to Mercy. There, I remember she was sent by her mistress to the jail, and Sarah Good was there, and Sarah Good asked for some tobacco, and she picked up chips or something off the floor and tossed it at her and said, "This is tobacco, good enough for you." And then Sarah Good might have mumbled something, maybe an incantation, who knows? And that sort of led to this amazing path of afflictions on her part. She was also, of course, a redeemed. She and her family had been kidnapped by Native Americans and later redeemed. And so there are, good arguments by other authors that these post-traumatic stress situations certainly might have led to or amplified behaviors and experiences later. And in her case, that probably is the case. But your question, this is about the time when there starts to be some criticism of what went on in Salem, some counter arguments. And there was an author named Robert Calf, who, as you might recall, wrote some very stinging critiques of what had happened and was a counter influence against sort of more witch hunting. And so it did fizzle at that time, and then there are a few gasps of it, and then you have this long pause before you get to 1741, and you have one more gasp of a diabolical possession. But it was on its way out, and those were the last two cases where it could have potentially blossomed into much more for both of those young women than it did. But both regained normality and drifted into historical obscurity then.
I love one of the parts of Mercy Short's story that Cotton reported on that I just think is so juicy is they were all going to get to see the book that the devil wanted them to sign, the death book. It was going to happen. The servant was getting sent to go get it, but there was a dangerous, surprising cat.
Yeah, I love that.
That shouldn't have been there.
Yeah. The Book of Death. And yes, so what happened was that the location in an upper level of a house or an attic was pinpointed of where to find the second Book of Death. And that servant went up and was spooked by a black cat that was unknown to them, jumped out, maybe from behind a door or a box or something, and scared the servant so badly that he wouldn't go back up to look for the Book of Death. So no Book of Death survives. We don't have that relic to study.
Yeah.
Yeah, those cases I just find they're so interesting. There's so many parallels between Mercy Short and Margaret Rule and the Salem afflicted people.
Yes.
But a very different outcome.
Yeah.
And Cotton Mather himself, he had a lot of interactions with Mercy Short and Margaret Rule.
Yeah, he's at the center of it. And you kind of wonder, was he beating the drum for another sort of big case to champion, or his position is a little hard to pinpoint sometimes, other than that was he an instigator? What was his role in it? But his diaries, which are published, which are huge, are fascinating to read. And a lot of the source material comes from his own words. And that was one of the best and richest sources, not only for the cases he was familiar with, but reflections on earlier cases or things he'd heard. And so that was a particularly rich source for the book.
Yeah, he's there reporting on so many pieces of history. Author Beth Crusoe and Dr. Kathy Hermes did an academic article on Thomas Thornton, and his daughter was written about by Cotton Mather, and Thomas Thornton's daughter got sick while living by Alice Young, who was the first woman hanged in Connecticut. And Cotton wrote about Priscilla Thornton. It's so fascinating. Cotton really seemed to be around reporting, and We also know that there were times where more people could have been implicated and they seemed to hold back. Like with Goody Glover, she pointed her finger, but we don't really know who those accused were. And so there must have been so many things influencing the outcomes. Just
Well, that's right. And you will get cases. I think part of it depended on the approach people had when the accusation came down. And wasn't it John Alden Jr. who sued for for libel, or I think it was. This was a Salem related incident. And that sort of dried up the criticism or the accusations right there when people thought maybe they'd be sued or fined. And that in a couple of the cases where like Anne Edmonds, I think it was, where she sued and had a judgment against the McDaniels, I believe, and ultimately escaped without too much injury. And so how did people respond? And there was no playbook. These were people who they probably had heard there'd been cases in earlier decades or at other times, but they wouldn't have known any of the details. There was no script for how to deal with this. People were, and I'm sure they were frightened, and so it was, and all the players were different each time, other than Cotton Mather, who appears basically everywhere and everything. In this book, he's in all the sections of the book, Cotton Mather makes an appearance. But it's fascinating to see those. The other thing that tantalized me, if I may just add this, were the cases that we'll never probably know very much about, where there were rumors about someone and what were the source of the rumors, what was actually said about someone, what had happened. There's the great story by John Dunton, who, and we don't know for sure that there was such a person, but he alleged that there was a lady, Mrs. D, who did sort of magic tricks in Boston, and she had people, there were rumors that she was a witch, and he recites one of her magic tricks. And so you wonder who were these people who the finger was pointed at, but it didn't take off. It died on the vine, and it never fomented up into a case. And the reason I mention that is because did they handle it differently? How did they respond to the accusations? And we don't know, because we don't know enough about those cases to know exactly how they responded or how their accusers responded to them when they encountered those people who were accused. So there's a lot of murkiness in these stories too, of things that we'll never quite know, but they're tantalizing clues. And my feeling is, if they're tantalizing clues, there may be more of a story somewhere that someday somehow will come out. So I tried to incorporate the fragmentary stories too, just because they could someday lead somewhere, and hopefully some of those will be fleshed out in time.
Yeah.
It's so good that you tell those stories too, because they're just overlooked because there aren't enough details for them to be considered by a lot of people. It's very vague. A rumor about a rumor kind of is a vague way of getting about it. But yeah, but those stories, we need to know the bigger picture of what was underlying the actual witch trials, because we know about the accusations that led to the charges, but these accusations that didn't lead to charges are just as important to understand.
Yeah. And I'm thinking of Alice Lake as you say that, and she was someone there was a possible infanticide, there was premarital fornication, there were a lot of things for her. It's a very, for lack of a better description, a sex-related case, and infanticide. And there's enough of a story there you can see what direction it took and ultimately cost her life. But for others, they're just, we just don't know. We don't know what they did or what the accusations really were. Or was it just an odd person or someone with dementia, or when it was easy for people to say, oh, she must be a witch because she's doing such odd things. And that to me is intriguing because you, again, will never know exactly what happened in those cases, but it, it, it wasn't people riding around in broomsticks. There were other things that were happening that caused people to think they were in the midst of witches.
Yeah. Thanks so much for this amazing conversation. And I really am, I'm so amazed by what your work, the organization that you've dedicated your life to, you're writing, what that is doing for the population, what their family research and how it fills out these stories and it fills out the answers about our society and our culture. You really did a great job of talking about what's available to people. But is there any other words of direction that you would like to offer about research?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the great thing about what I do, and I feel very blessed to work, to have had a career and to continue in a career that gives people a journey of self-discovery. And I've seen over and over again the moments where someone discovers something and the joy or the curiosity that it brings, and it invests us in history much more. And I use an example from my own research. I did a lot of work on one of my grandmothers was from Pennsylvania and Philadelphia and Bucks County. And I wrote a book on one of the families on that side of the family. And it immersed me in Quaker history and how William Penn, what he did, and how Pennsylvania was created and established. And oddly, I thought back on it and I thought, sure, we might have had William Penn, and I'm sure we did in school and in a history book, and maybe he was treated for a day or half an hour or something. But I thought, I've now just immersed myself in the study of something that to me was really interesting and eye-opening and exciting. Now, I grant you, not all your listeners are going to find Quaker history fascinating and interesting, but for everyone, there is some story that is going to grab you and reel you in and make you wonder about something. And I just love being able to do that. And one of the fun things we've done, if I have time to tell you this little story, we've worked over the years, in addition to the television shows doing this, we've worked with a lot of famous people over the years and given them their family histories. And I always say that America's great storytellers often don't know their own story. They've been so busy amazing other things. But for example, when we gave Doris Kearns Goodwin her family history, and she had a view of what her ancestry was, but it was very incomplete. It was just one little portion of her ancestry. She had no idea. She had the colonial American ancestry, and her book, The Bully Pulpit, had just come out on Theodore Roosevelt and William Howard Taft, and they're both cousins of hers. So when we revealed this to her, the shock, excitement, enthusiasm, the delight registered across her, and she's still very, very interested in it. Or when we revealed to Ken Burns his connection to Abraham Lincoln, we knew he idolized Lincoln. And so I said to one of my colleagues, see if you can't make a connection to Lincoln. There probably isn't one. There is one, and it's very close. And he didn't know this. And so famous people this happens for, and everyday people like you and me, everyone has got a story that will surprise and excite and engage them. Sometimes they're painful stories. We have a Jewish Institute, the American Jewish Historical Society Archives, and our Weiner Center for Jewish Family History. And Holocaust stories are painful, but sometimes it is the story of how the struggle of someone who came over, how they got here, how they got started, how they became American. And you can, even from the painful stories, you can find great inspiration. And so we're all connected to history in fascinating ways. And everybody has a unique tale. And I just would, in inspiring people to do this, I would just say, your story is worth knowing, and you're going to discover some things that will if you do this long enough, you're going to find some things that will surprise you and fascinate you. And some family stories will fall. That happens a lot. And other stories are confirmed. And sometimes it's something you had no idea. Complete surprise. So it's a very enriching experience. And I love to proselytize people into doing their family history.
If today's conversation sparks something for you, whether that is curiosity about Boston's witchcraft history, a desire to dig into your own family tree, we hope you will keep exploring.
The resources are available in our show notes, and the work is far from finished. Thank you for listening to The Thing About Witch Hunts. Have a great today and a beautiful tomorrow.